Hello and welcome to the 2020 Bartholomews Winter Wheat Variety Trials. Usually we'd be welcoming hundreds of you to our trial sites across the south of England, but this year we're having to do it virtually. This year we're looking at 20 different winter wheat varieties at our Chalton, Hampshire site. Now you can use the links down in the description to go through to the varieties that may be of interest to you. If you just click the timestamps, it will take you straight there. But now I'll pass you over to my colleague Eloise Griffin-Hicks, who is our trials coordinator, and will talk you through the pros and cons of each variety this year.
We'll start our tour off looking at Blossom. Unfortunately, this was a candidate variety back in the autumn when we decided to include it, and further to tests that the HDB have done, it now no longer qualifies as a milling wheat candidate variety. We've got no information about it, and the HDB will go no further with it at all. We then move on to an old favourite, Crusoe. Obviously the untreated is being hit quite hard with brown rust at the moment, but it is only a 3 on the HDB score rating for brown rust. It's faring an awful lot better than it did last year. This time last year it had almost entirely broken down until there was very little green leaf area remaining. Last year in our trial it was one of the lowest untreated variety yields at 6.3 tonnes to the hectare, but given a fairly robust fungicide programme it achieved 11.6 tonnes to the hectare. Now we move on to Illustrious. It's a variety that's been growing in popularity over the past 3 years. It has some fantastic disease ratings, a 6 for brown rust, 9 for yellow rust and 6 for septoria. The HDB therefore gives it a 96% yield potential scoring, and it's always performed very well on our trial here at Hampshire, achieving 11.3 tonnes to the hectare. We now move on to Skyfall, which was a very important variety for us last season, where autumn drilling conditions were awful and a lot of farmers were still drilling into January and February. Skyfall's got some good disease characteristics and achieved a yield of 11.5 tonnes to the hectare treated, which was one of the highest Group 1s on the site. It has a brown rust score of 8, a yellow rust score of 5 and a septoria score of 5.8. We're now looking at Zyatt, which has the highest AHDB yield potential of all of the Group 1s at 99%. This was seen as it was tied with Skyfall last year for the highest yield of the Group 1s at 11.5 tonnes to the hectare. It's a very nice looking variety, fairly clean and can be treated relatively easily. We now look at our first of the Group 2s, Siskin. It has an AHDB yield rating of 101%. It achieved a fair yield last year of 11.9 tonnes to the hectare on this site, predominantly down to a high yellow rust score of 9 and a relatively high septoria score of 6.6. We're now looking at Extase, and when you compare it directly with Siskin you can see that the Siskin is slightly greener, and we did see that reflected in yield last year where Siskin out-yielded Extase by 0.7 of a tonne. Even though they do have the same yield rating from the HDB of 101%, and they have actually got very similar disease ratings, but they're both steady varieties and when treated properly can yield well. Moving on to our Group 3s. Group 3 is an area that's become very interesting for us over the past year with the closure of Rank Hovis, and we seem to be getting a lot of interest from the continent for Group 3s, specifically high protein Group 3s to go into bread, rather than the traditional Group 3 which is low protein and generally used for biscuit making. Our first of the Group 3s is Basset. It has some good AHDB ratings, if not a little bit low on the septoria score of 5.5. The HDB give it a yield rating of 98%. On this site in particular we've seen it falling behind other Group 3s in terms of yield, with it only achieving 11.6 tonnes to the hectare last year. We now move on to Elicit. And when you directly compare it with Basset, you can see that the plot for Elicit is an awful lot greener, despite them having similar AHDB scorings. The HDB give this a yield rating of 100%, while the brown rust, yellow rust and septoria are fairly similar. Last year in the trial, The Elicit achieved 0.7 tonnes per hectare yield increase over that of Basset on the treated yields, and you can see when you look at them side by side, Basset is really starting to fall behind and the choice between the two starts to become obvious. Firefly, which boasts a yellow rust score of 9. However, when we first had it in the trial last year, we were shocked to see it breaking down to yellow rust really early on in the season. This has since been explained by the HDB and the breeder that the plant needs to reach maturity before the disease characteristics are realised. However, that said, when treated, it achieved 12.3 tonnes to the hectare, which is more than double the untreated yield. Moving on to RGT Galactus. I don't have any past yield information, but I do have some scores that look very promising indeed. Galactus has a brown rust rating of 9, a yellow rust rating of 8, and a Septorius score of 6. This gives it an AHDB yield potential of 101%, and it'll be very interesting to see what this achieves when we take it through to yield. Our final group 3 is W380, a coded variety. I have zero information about this variety at all, but it is a little early look-see before it's even got onto the HDB candidate list. It'll be very exciting to see how this variety develops over the future and if it makes it onto the list. We start our group 4s with Skyscraper. We had this in our trial for the first time last year and it yielded very well. A treated yield of 12.2 tonnes to the hectare, which mirrors the HDB score of 105% yield potential. Has a very high yellow rust score of 8, a brown rust score of 6 and a Septorius score of 5. We now move on to KWS Kinetic, which is a new variety for this year on the IHDB recommended list. I don't have any trials data for it for last year, but it does have an AHDB yield rating of 104%, which is quite high. Unfortunately, you can see that the untreated side has broken down rather quickly to Septoria. This is almost to be expected as the Septorius score is only 5, but when you compare it with the 5 for Skyscraper, it does look like Kinetic is maybe a little bit weaker. We're now looking at Theodore, which is a very attractive variety to be looking at, nice and bright green. It has the highest Septorius score on the list of 8.2 and a very high yellow rust score of 9 and a high brown rust score of 7, and we can see how green the untreated plot is. I have high hopes for this and hope that this is all realised in the yield. We now move on to Graham. Graham is a very popular variety in the West. It's been around for a long time. It's got a good AHDB yield rating of 102%, but didn't quite achieve a very high treated yield last year of 11.5 tonnes to the hectare. This may be because it is an ageing variety and the genetics just aren't standing up any longer. Next to Graham we have another Syngenta offering of Gleam, and you can see a step up in genetics, and we certainly saw a step up in yield last year. Gleam achieved the highest yield across the whole site of 12.9 tonnes to the hectare, which is reflected in the AHDB rating of 103% potential yield. It's a very nice, clean looking variety and is definitely an improvement on Graham, which is now becoming maybe slightly dated. A variety here which is definitely starting to show its age is Costello. Unfortunately, the HDB only gives it a 99% yield rating, and when we're looking at group 4s we're really looking for barn fillers, and 99% just isn't cutting it. It didn't do anything spectacular on this site last year. Its yellow rust rating is good, but for brown rust and Septoria it's really not quite cutting the mustard. We're now looking at Gravity, which is a relatively new variety and achieved a very high yield last year of 12.3 tonnes to the hectare in this trial. It has a good yellow rust score of 8, a middling brown rust score of 6 and a relatively low Septorius score of 4.8, but nonetheless a variety that can perform. And our final variety is the newest offering from Syngenta of Insitor. It's got a 105% yield rating from the AHDB. It's the first year we've had this particular variety in the trial, and it'll be really good to see how it yields treated and untreated, so we can get a good feel for if this is a step up again from Graham and Gleam.
Thank you for watching our 2020 winter wheat varieties video. Make sure you subscribe so you can be notified of future videos from us. And again, I'll now leave you with the 2019 data from our sites. But be sure to come back to us as we'll be presenting the 2020 yield data very soon.